Okay, it looks like that we can all hear, and I'm going to start the video now. And it looks like we have about 28 people in tonight's presentation, so I'm glad to see that. And let's go ahead and get started. It's nearly 7, so let's just go ahead and get started now. Appreciate you all being here tonight. We're going to talk about the 1918 flu pandemic, and hopefully all this technology will work, and we'll be able to you'll be able to see. If you have any problems at all during the presentation, just hit me in the chat box and I'll see what I can do to fix it. Again, thank you all for being here. I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the Historical Research Center at UAMS, and the Historical Research Center is the archives department of the UAMS library. We're located in the Ed 2 building on the UAMS campus, if you know where that is. Our mission is to preserve the history of UAMS as well as the history of the health sciences in Arkansas. So speaking of that, the Historical Research Center really wants to document this period in our history. So I'm asking you tonight to help us collect materials. We'd love to have any flyers that say, wash your hands or stay 6 feet back or 6 feet apart. And, you know, anything like that we really would like to have for our collection. Of course, don't tear them off the wall or do anything like that. But if you do come across something, we would really appreciate having those for our collection. And if anyone wants to make a quilt out of all of those old fabric masks that are going to be floating around, wash them first and make us a quilt, and we'd gladly accept that for our collection. So tonight, and I put the Historical Research Center, our email address is on the screen, so if you have any questions, please feel free to email. Tonight's, this is the second stay-at-home lecture sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the Friends group for the Historical Research Center. If you're not a member of the Society, I encourage you to do so. The membership dues are pretty inexpensive. $15 for an individual, $5 if you're a student. So I have the website up on the screen. It's pretty long. If you go to the Historical Research Center's page on the UAMS Library website, you'll have a link from there as well, so you don't have to copy down that long URL right there. If you want to, you can also just go to PayPal, paypal.me/shmhp, and you can just pay your dues directly from there, or make a donation if you'd like to make a donation. So in addition to these lectures, the Society also sponsors an annual dinner and lecture. We had to cancel this year, or we had to reschedule this year's dinner. We're hoping to reschedule it for a little bit later in the year. But I hope you'll be getting more information about that, and I hope you'll consider joining us for that too. Now, a few notes before we jump into tonight's presentation. I have muted everyone, your audio, so no one else can hear you. If you have something that you want to ask at the end of the session, if you want to ask a question, you can just type it into the chat box. Everyone will see your question, and the chat will be saved for posterity, as well this recording. We are recording this presentation. So if you'd like to go back and re-watch this presentation, you'll be able to do so at a later date. The second note tonight is I've actually turned off your video as well, so no one else can see you. So that's probably someone wanted me to make sure that I told everyone that tonight. And then the final note for tonight is, and I've just mentioned this, if you'd like to ask any questions, please do so at the end of the presentation in the chat box. And just a little bit more about the stay-at-home lecture series. We're going to be having these the first and third Thursdays of this month, May, June, and July. The last one will be July 16th. And I've tried not to do it all by myself. I've gotten a few other people to to participate. So, and I think we have a pretty good lineup of topics and presenters. So I hope you'll be able to join us. They're at 7 o'clock every first and third Thursday of this month, next month, and July. We'll relook at it in July and see if we want to continue on with this. We do like to offer in-person presentations, and we hope to do that as soon as we're able to do so. Let's see. Okay, so for tonight, we are going to talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic. It's also known as the Spanish influenza. And I know we're probably all a little weary of the word pandemic. We're tired of being at home, and we're tired of even watching TV. And that probably has lost some of its luster. I know it has for me. So we're going to sit back tonight. We're going to dive into the 1918 influenza pandemic, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit of history tonight. In 1918, a skipping rhyme was being sung by children around the world. I had a little bird, and its name was Enza. I opened the window, and in flew Enza. This children's skipping song came into vogue in 1918 as the flu pandemic made its way around the world and quickly became the worst epidemic the United States has ever known. Though this rhyme is humorous, there is nothing funny about the flu, as anyone who has actually had the flu knows. The song, though, illustrates how impactful the flu epidemic of 1918 was on our culture and how it really imprinted itself on that generation. Now, at the same time as World War I was winding down, a health crisis was being fought by countries around the world. The pandemic, known as the Spanish flu, affected the populace throughout 1918 and 1919, and it ranks as one of the deadliest disease outbreaks in recorded history, as an estimated 50 million deaths occurred worldwide, with nearly 700,000 of those in the United States alone. There were many deaths during the 1918-19 flu that were most likely not attributed to the flu. So historians have theorized that the number of deaths could be as high as 100 million people. Lackluster record keeping, political revolutions, and natural disasters most likely caused some deaths from the flu, but were not accurately recorded. The lack of medical care, particularly in the African American communities in the United States, and poor communication and information dispersal, among other factors, contributed to the staggering number of deaths. The disease reached from the United States to the remote Pacific Islands and even the Arctic, and touched every level of society, from farmers, businessmen, entertainers, and politicians. Now it's considered that there were three waves of the 1918 pandemic. The first wave occurred in the spring of that year, and it was minor compared to the following two. The second wave came in the fall of 1918, and it included the virus that had come through in the spring of that year, but there was also another minor mutated version. So those who had been infected in the spring, actually, there were some of them who got reinfected by this mutated strain in the fall. The second wave caused the highest number of deaths. The third wave occurred in the first few months of 1919, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the 1918 waves of that. The pandemic it's infamous just for the number of people that were affected by it, and it had a really unusual high mortality rate in young adults, about 15 to 44 years of age, and also the middle age, 45 to 64 years of age. Those under the age of 65 actually totaled about 99% of the deaths from that 1918 flu. Persons between ages 15 and 35 actually had the highest number of observed deaths. And it was a rapidly spreading strain of the flu, and it affected every class of society, as I mentioned, including doctors and nurses, as we're seeing today. And so that really affected the medical care, because many doctors and nurses were affected with the flu, and that took them out of the fight, which it's sort of like a vicious circle. Now, even though we call it the Spanish flu, but even though we do call it that, it's kind of a misnomer. Its origins had nothing to do with the European country, aside from the news about aside from the fact that that was the first country that actually reported the disease. In the midst of World War I, both sides censored any information that could be construed as a weakness. So when soldiers began to succumb to the flu, information about the ferocity and impact of it on the troops was kept from the public. It wasn't until the flu hit the neutral country of Spain that reports actually began to emerge, and then people started associating the virus with the country, hence the Spanish flu. Now, there is some debate in the historical and historical communities as to where the epidemic started. The predominant theory, though, is that it started in the United States in Haskell County, Kansas, a rural part of that state where swine and poultry lived in relatively close proximity to people. Local men from Haskell County reported to Camp Funston in eastern Kansas to train before being sent overseas to fight in World War I. There at Camp Funston, the flu began its ascent. With the first reported flu diagnosis in early March 1918, by April, over 1,000 soldiers had contracted the virus. This strain of the flu acted very, very quickly. In some cases, soldiers drowned from the fluid in their lungs within 12 hours of feeling sick. So it was a really fast-acting strain of the flu. And of course, military camps were perfect breeding grounds for the flu, as soldiers were cramped into barracks and were transferred around the country and world, making it easy for a soldier to be an unsuspecting carrier. Another theory suggests the virus originated in northern China as early as 1917. When Chinese laborers were recruited to work in France and Britain, they brought the virus with them, and it quickly spread from there throughout Western Europe. Wherever it began, though, the virus spread quickly, and it affected the global population. The flu reached epidemic proportions in different parts of the United States at different times in the last part of 1918. Urban areas were infected sooner than the rural areas because of the high density population and the high volume traffic of people leaving and entering the cities. In Arkansas, the epidemic started to hit in late summer, early fall, with central Arkansas being affected first. With the state population at around 1.5 million in 1918, Little Rock was the state's most populated city at over 60,000. The central Arkansas area, as a result, was the first in the state to be felled by the epidemic. Central Arkansas was also the hardest hit during the epidemic. The mortality rates from the flu in the central part of the state were the highest, followed by the northwest corner. The Delta counties saw the lowest mortality rate during the epidemic. The Delta, of course, is where the majority of the state's African American population lived. And most likely that number is probably, the number of deaths are probably low because African Americans did not have equal access to health care. The numbers probably weren't reported as well as they were in other parts of the state. So it's possible, it's probable that the numbers are a lot higher in Arkansas. There were about 7,000 people who died from the flu in 1918. According to the Arkansas Gazette, the Spanish flu made its first appearance in Little Rock in late 1918. The September 18th edition of the paper warned its readers that the flu was the, quote, real thing and as Spanish as a bullfight or a fandango, end quote, and it was in the capital city. Dr. James C. Geiger, the United States Public Health Service official in Little Rock, cautioned that there would be additional cases. He also noted that there was no immunity for the disease, and Little Rockians should take precautions to prevent the spread of it. Although it seems that the influenza started taking hold in central Arkansas in September, it's entirely possible that it entered Arkansas earlier, perhaps in sporadic cases. In an April 18, 1918 issue of the Southern Standard newspaper in Arkadelphia, it was reported that, quote, there seems to be an epidemic of influenza or cold among the children of the community, end quote. 2 days after announcing the Spanish flu had its entrada into Little Rock, the Gazette proclaimed that the disease was just a plain old grip, as the flu was often called because of the grip it got on victims. And it was no different than any other flu throughout history. The symptoms described were familiar to Little Rock residents and included sudden onset of chills, severe headache, pain in the back, general feeling of depression, and fever from 101 to 104 degrees. In the newspaper article, Dr. Geiger asked that all physicians report cases immediately, but he reiterated that the Spanish flu was just a simple, plain old-fashioned variety of it. Yet by September 24th, 125 cases of the flu had been identified in Carlisle and Lonoke County. Dr. Geiger placed the town, located about 35 miles from Little Rock, under quarantine, and no one was allowed to enter or leave Carlisle without having a certificate from health authorities. Now, the September 26th edition of the Arkansas Gazette noted that Camp Pike in the northern part of Pulaski County had started to take precautionary measures to prevent the spreading of what camp officials called, quote, bad colds, end quote. While the officials were hopeful that the sniffles would not turn out to be the Spanish flu, individual units on the base had been quarantined in the western and eastern sections. With over 50,000 people at Camp Pike, it could be considered the second largest city in the state at that time. The outbreak of the flu could spread very quickly, and officials had to stay ahead of the situation. At the time, the officials did not anticipate a general quarantine of the camp, despite the number of cases. However, the camp admitted the next day that the over 300 cases of, quote, the bad colds were indeed influenza, but the recent deaths of several soldiers from pneumonia were not linked to the flu, when they most likely were. In other bases in various parts of the country, soldiers from Arkansas were also succumbing to the flu. George S. Martin, son of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Martin of Little Rock, died at Camp Dix, New Jersey. In his obituary, the Gazette noted that Martin was a graduate of Little Rock High School and captain of the 1910 football team. Martin would, unfortunately, be only one of the many native-born soldiers and regular Arkansans killed by the disease. The flu continued to ravage Camp Pike, even though camp officials assured the public that the situation was not serious, despite there being 756 new influenza cases by September 29th. To prevent even more cases, though, congregation in quarantine areas were banned, and the moving pictures that were normally shown in the YMCA building were temporarily discontinued. Visitors were discouraged from coming to the camp. While the officials were assuring the public that everything was fine, there must have been some worry at the camp and higher up, because the call for 9,000 soldiers who were supposed to arrive at Camp Pike in October for training was canceled. Even for the next few days, articles would continue to tout a flu outbreak as a non-serious situation, despite there being over 7,600 influenza patients. They also continued to declare that none of the recent deaths were directly related to the flu. Instead, they stated that the deaths were because of pneumonia, which of course could be a result of the flu. The October 1st issue of the Arkansas Gazette ran two significant articles regarding the flu. One noted that the flu had claimed its first victim at Eberts Field, the airfield located in Lonoke. The base had over 100 reported cases. The Gazette also quoted Dr. Geiger about the situation in Little Rock under the headline, quote, "Influenza epidemic threatens the city," end quote. Quote, "It is apparent that Little Rock is about to enter the Spanish influenza zone," Dr. Geiger noted. He reported that 67 cases of the disease had been reported in the capital city in the last 2 days, but he still did not consider the situation serious. However, he noted that there was not really anything one could do to prevent getting the disease. Dr. Geiger did, however, finally acknowledge that the Spanish flu was more severe than the grip. Despite the number of flu cases increasing dramatically day by day, including a total of 131 new cases on October 2nd, Dr. Geiger tried to reassure the public and said, quote, "We still have the situation in hand," end quote. But he cautioned people with colds or other symptoms of the disease to stay at home. Quote, "Visiting should be curtailed," he warned. He praised the doctors of Little Rock in cooperating with the state health officials, but urged North Little Rock doctors who had been lax to report cases immediately. Dr. Geiger, for the first time, also raised the possibility of placing Little Rock under a quarantine. Little Rock now had a total of 350 cases of influenza, and the city's residents were becoming scared. One woman riding a streetcar was quoted in the newspaper as saying, "Ka-choo, ka-choo, Lord, I'm getting that Spanish flu." Dr. Charles W. Garrison, the state health officer, reported that the epidemic was spreading around the state and had reached Hot Springs, Stuttgart, and El Dorado. It's likely that the flu had extended its fingers to most parts of the state, though, by that time. While Little Rock was beginning to see the ramping up of the epidemic, Camp Pike was absolutely being ravaged by it. The number of cases reported at the camp jumped exponentially. The week ending October 5th, 1918, saw 1,285 cases being reported. Because of this astounding rate of infection, camp officials made the decision to quarantine the entire camp. All enlisted men were forbidden from leaving the camp. Officers, however, were not subjected to the quarantine and could leave the camp and come and go as they wanted to. But once they were out of the camp, they were cautioned to not enter theaters, moving picture shows, or participate in any public gathering. Civilians were barred from entering Camp Pike soon after. For the first time, the gravity of the situation at the camp was reported in the newspaper. The Gazette noted that week that it was a much dire situation in evidence, and noted that 25 soldiers and one nurse had already died at the base. And it was finally confirmed that the deaths, which were caused by pneumonia, were caused by pneumonia, a direct result of the flu. So the officials started gradually acknowledging all these, how severe the flu was at that time. With the flu affecting nearly every aspect of society, the men and women of Little Rock and North Little Rock helped their fellow citizens. Eric Hamilton, a Little Rock confectioner, offered to deliver cakes, candy, and preserved fruit to the soldiers at Camp Pike during its quarantine. Likewise, Little Rock's boathouse accommodated relatives of soldiers as well as physicians and surgeons helping to fight the epidemic. While the quarantine provided some defense against the disease, the flu still advanced through the camp. The week ending October 12th saw 4,299 more cases, and the week ending with October 19th saw another 3,137 cases reported. The mortality rate from influenza at Camp Pike was increasing exponentially, so much so that Owens and Company, undertakers in North Little Rock, which had been given the government contract for the camp, was overwhelmed. there were so many soldiers dying at the camp that Owens employed night and day shifts, and the Army assigned 9 government embalmers to the Owens Funeral Home to help with the situation. The local newspapers across the state were filled with obituaries of soldiers who had died from the flu at Camp Pike. One such casualty was Private Herschel Orton from Pine Bluff. The Pine Bluff Daily Graphic newspaper was one of the media outlets that gave extensive coverage to the flu fatalities. Orton was noted as being one of the most popular men in Pine Bluff. Later, the Camp Pike commandant instructed the Owens Funeral Home to not supply the newspaper with the obituaries for soldiers because the string of deaths at the camp was hurting morale. As the flu continued to spread throughout the state, the United States Health Service continued to issue warnings on how to prevent the spread of influenza, despite Dr. Geiger still insisting that there was nothing one could do to prevent from being infected. The health service urged people to not kiss and to keep their mouths and teeth clean. Also, the health service advised people to avoid worry, fear, and fatigue. Meanwhile, the situation in Little Rock continued to deteriorate. Dr. Geiger, in his usual manner, continued to declare that the influenza epidemic was not alarming and the daily increase of 200 cases was completely normal. He declared that a quarantine in Little Rock was unnecessary. Quote, "A general quarantine is both unwise and unnecessary. It would mean that all theaters, schools, department stores, factories, churches, streetcars, and all other public gatherings would be closed," end quote. He said that the surest way to stamp out the flu was to rest in bed if symptoms appeared, to be sure the room was well ventilated, and to collect all sputum and discharges from the eyes on bits of cloth and burn them. Yet Little Rock's government official and business officials started to close public attractions so as to curtail the epidemic. Forest Park dancing parlors were closed, it was announced, and would remain that way until after the disease threat had passed. The closing of the dance parlors was actually fortuitous because only a day later, the State Board of Health and the usual cautious Dr. Geiger imposed a statewide quarantine to contain the influenza. By this time, state cases of the flu had reached 1,800. This quarantine affected every aspect of life: schools, churches, fairs, and other places of amusements, and any public gathering were ordered closed by Geiger. Furthermore, the order prohibited children under 18 years of age from boarding a streetcar or to be on the streets except in absolute necessity. Now, ironically, children over age 14 who were regularly employed were exempt from the order. And the order did not bar people from traveling from city to city. Despite the quarantine going into effect at noon on Monday, October 7th, Little Rock theaters were allowed to stay open through that Monday night, perhaps to give citizens one last thrill before the cabin fever would inevitably set in. Across the state, people were faced with restrictions on gatherings on every aspect of daily life. Citizens were told not to congregate, and the quarantine took care of that. They didn't have to worry about that because the quarantine canceled all forms of entertainment, church services, and any other public gathering. Interestingly, theaters, as I mentioned, were allowed to stay open one night past the quarantine. Schools were also affected, of course. An article in the Arkansas Gazette noted that the attendance in the Stuttgart schools had already been reduced by 50%, and about a quarter of the town's population had been diagnosed with the flu. In fact, the state was in the flu's strong grip. Pine Bluff, which at the time had a population of nearly 20,000, was reported to have between 1,000 and 1,500 cases. The quarantine closed the town down and even affected Branch Normal College, which stayed closed until early November. And even before the quarantine went into effect, one of the churches, Beach Street Baptist Church in Pine Bluff, had suspended services because of the impact of the flu on its congregation. But this interruption was not just limited to the Delta. It wasn't limited to Pine Bluff. It repeated itself all around the state. Mainstay institutions around Arkansas, like the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, shuttered its doors as the flu continued its march. The epidemic not only affected social and educational institutions, but it also impacted the legal community. Federal Judge Jacob Treiber, he adjourned the federal court in Helena in early October after only one day because of the quarantine. And even though in that one day they were able to get a lot of business done, because it resulted in 40 cases being referred to grand juries and 3 indictments were handed out in just that one day. Now, unfortunately, what comes with a pandemic, you have a lot of stories about families being impacted and affected in a lot of different ways, and this was played out around the entire state. One such story was the Barrett family in Helena. Emma Barrett and her 2 sons, Robert and Charles, all died on October 8th from complications from the flu. Their deaths left Mr. Barrett and 1 remaining son alone. As I mentioned, this scene was unfortunately repeated around the state throughout the duration of the pandemic. Now, as citizens were urged to take precautions to help in the spread of the flu, the newspapers around the state touted patent medicines that could prevent one from actually getting the flu or make one feel better if they happened to contract it. And of course, patent medicines in the 19-teens, they were rampant. And so there was pretty much a patent medicine, a quack medicine for anything that ailed you. Humphreys 77 and Mint Alba were just 2 of the remedies that were promoted in the newspaper. Humphreys 77 touted its ability to break up coughs, colds, influenza, cold in the head, inflammation of the mucous membranes, sore throat, tonsillitis, and many other things. Mint Alba noted that the flu was contracted through the nose, and so to prevent that, they had menthol that you would insert in your nose to prevent you from getting the flu. Those weren't the only ones, though. Grove's Tasteless Chill Tonic and Horlick's Malted Milk were touted as surefire ways to cure the flu, but apparently even Smoko tobacco-less cigarettes would do the trick too. The daily newspapers were filled with these advertisements and also articles giving medical advice. One article titled Spanish Influenza, What It Is, still referred to it as that old grip and told that those infected to go to bed, stay quiet, and take a laxative. The flu epidemic raged on in Little Rock. By October 10th, there were another reported 951 cases of the flu, bringing the total reported cases to over 3,100. Dr. Geiger, who up to this point was still assuring the public that the epidemic was not bad, finally admitted in a newspaper interview that the situation was, quote, unquestionably bad, end quote. Yet he stated it was still the epidemic, the flu was well under control, and it was not as serious as it was sometimes rumored. He urged people to not congregate or spit on the sidewalk, which could spread the disease. In Saline County, the flu continued to affect every aspect of life. As the Benton Courier noted in its October 10th edition, quote, no epidemic has had its grip on this country and county as had the Spanish influenza. Very few have escaped, and in some, every member of the family has been affected in more or less some degree, end quote. The Courier also noted that the local doctors had been swamped with calls, but they had done nobly in attending their patients. Even large companies like the American Bauxite Company was affected by the epidemic and had to shut down its plant because so many of its workers became sick. By the middle of October, though, reports were being issued that the epidemic was getting better, despite there being another 713 cases reported statewide. Dr. Charles Garrison, the state health officer, requested that all surgeons and physicians postpone operations and surgeries, except those that were considered essential, mainly so that every physician would be available to combat the epidemic. Now, by October 17th, the newspapers were announcing that the epidemic at Camp Pike was virtually over. The camp had been on quarantine, if you'll remember, since early October. Much praise was heaped on Colonel Charles Miller, the camp's commanding officer. Editorials praised him for his prompt measures in handling the disease. His efforts to keep the morale up at the camp were also commended. Of special note were the, quote, cheer-up wagons, end quote, that went through the camp to keep the men's spirits up. The wagons furnished music and vaudeville shows to the troops. A From Camp Pike column in the Courier in mid-October mentioned, in the Benton Courier in mid-October, mentioned some of the entertainment available to the quarantined soldiers. The soldiers were treated to all sorts of games, with prizes being awarded ranging from 25 cents to $5. The pie eating contest apparently was the highlight of the festivities, with some of the boys having enough pie on their faces to, quote, do them for a while, end quote. The atmosphere was so festive that the journalist soldier described it as being just like the 4th of July. He noted that the largest brass band we have ever seen and all the screaming and hollering that you've ever heard took place. While the soldiers had quite the entertainment options during the quarantine, I'm sure none were too sad, though, when on October 26th, camp officials announced the quarantine was lifted. In total, it was estimated that over 10,000 camp personnel had been infected with the influenza and over 700 had died. The Gazette reported that by October 22nd, over 9,500 cases of the flu had been reported statewide, with 266 deaths. For all intents and purposes, though, the epidemic seemed to be breaking around the state. Soon, the quarantine restrictions were loosened. Religious services resumed, and churches could hold one service on Sundays, and the colleges and universities could resume classes. Yet Dr. Garrison, the state health officer, ordered the end to public funerals, allowing only family members to attend. Yet oftentimes, other family members were so sick with the flu that no one attended the funeral except the grave digger and preacher. And there were many funerals around the state. Mrs. O.T. Bush of the Saltillo community in Faulkner County remembered that there was a funeral every day and that it was hard to find enough healthy men to dig the graves. One Arkansas County woman remembered that as a child, she saw 2 wagons, each carrying a large box, the coffins of Sam Reagan and his son-in-law. No family members were well enough to travel along to the cemetery. In Benton, Ashby Funeral Home was kept busy. The funeral home on average saw 7 to 15 funerals per month in the late 19-teens. In October 1918, though, the business oversaw 71 funerals. But even as the epidemic started to wind down, deaths still continued to occur. Florence Geiger, the wife of Dr. J.C. Geiger, who continually had stated that the flu was not that bad, died in late October. Later, it was discovered that even Dr. Geiger had contracted the Spanish flu. He fully recovered, but it showed that the flu did not choose favorites. October was a rough month, though, for everyone. In that month alone, 9,813 cases of the flu were reported. Of those, 351 died. On Halloween 1918, Dr. Geiger announced that the statewide quarantine would be canceled. Though it wasn't reported, I'm sure that there was a lot of dancing in the streets across the state. The Benton Courier, the newspaper, reported that there had actually been a lot of cheering about the end of the quarantine, and it had also noted again that the epidemic had been one of the worst to strike the area for many years. In many instances, the paper noted, whole families had been ill at the same time with no one to care for the sick. A number of deaths also occurred. One of those was Louise Whitwell, age 5. Louise was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. E.N. Whitwell and died at the family home in rural Saline County. While the little girl's burial was taking place, her 4-month-old brother died. Unfortunately, this scene likely played out many times around the state. By the end of 1918, the epidemic had ended, and though there were still sporadic cases of the influenza through the winter and into 1919, as I mentioned. At the end of November, though, 1918, 2 schools in central Arkansas were quarantined once again when it looked like the flu was making its resurgence. The Deaf School in Little Rock and Central College in Conway were both placed under isolation. There were 34 cases of the flu at Central College, while the Deaf School had 16. It was proven, though, it had been proven, though, that these lockdowns actually worked. The tuberculosis sanatorium in Boonville went on self-imposed quarantine at the beginning of the epidemic, and no cases of the flu were reported at that facility during the entire duration of the epidemic. Dr. Garrison, the state health officer, declared in early December that the flu was leaving Little Rock. There were only 100 people who still had the flu, he reported. While that was a cause for celebration, students in the Little Rock School District, and I'm sure districts around the state, soon learned that the schools would not be closed for New Year's Day. Instead, they would be open to make up time missed due to the epidemic. And that happened with all the holidays when they were normally have been out, they went to school to make up the lost days. Towns across all sections of the Delta were hit in late fall, while other parts of Arkansas saw their flu numbers decreasing. Hazen and Prairie County and Des Arc were being hit particularly hard. The town of about 1,000 people had reported 100 additional cases, and its schools remained closed. The town of Carlisle, which had been quarantined early on in the epidemic, found itself in isolation again. And the flu continued to march through the Delta, as I mentioned, as the rest of Arkansas cast it off. Crossett and Hamburg at one point were dealing with 400 and 500 cases of the flu. For the towns whose populations were around 2,000 and 1,000 respectively, the flu incapacitated both towns. Later, by mid-December, reports to the state health department revealed that Ashley County was still dealing with 600 cases of the flu. And Helena was still grappling with it as well, so much so that the annual conference of the Arkansas State Baptist Convention was moved from Helena to Little Rock. In January 1919, as I mentioned, it was announced that there were more local outbreaks of the flu, but not to the extent as it had been in 1918. Advertisements once again popped up in the newspapers giving advice on what to do if you had the flu. One even gave an advice on how to fight a German or a germ, despite the fact that World War I had ended in late 1918. With the threat of more flu cases, preachers and pastors around the state urged the state's citizens to pray. One in Fort Smith even wrote a song, quote, "It was God's mighty hand. He is judging this old land. North, south, east, and west can be seen. Yes, he's killed the rich and poor, and he's gonna kill some more if you don't turn from your shame," end quote. Overall, the flu epidemic killed about 7,000 Arkansans, and the flu had political consequences as well. Because of the epidemic, there was a low turnout for the vote on a new state constitution in 1918, which had provisions for women's suffrage and prohibition of alcohol, and that ended up being defeated. Though the epidemic impacted the state, it resulted in relatively few changes to public policy. The governor did receive the power to issue quarantines, something that had been held only by the federal U.S. Health Service official. And interestingly, I noted that the role of the University of Arkansas Medical School during the flu pandemic of 1918 is not well documented. and very few mentions are made of the medical school in the newspapers at the time. But interestingly, during the 1919 legislative session, a bill was introduced to abolish the medical school. But I think that speaks more to the continued animosity and distrust of the school because of its financial instability, which was prevalent at the time, rather than its importance during the pandemic. But it's interesting to note that the medical school, it's unclear what role it played in fighting the flu in 1918. Now, while the flu ravages on society still on an annual basis, our mechanisms to combat the disease obviously have greatly improved since 1918. But in some ways, we are still stuck like we were a century ago with equal access to medical care. And I think many people have drawn parallels between what we're dealing with now with COVID-19 and the 1918 flu pandemic. There are certain takeaways that you can, if you compare the two. One, that society always comes out on the other side of a pandemic. They did in 1918, we will now as well. Two, communities, you really see communities coming together to help each other during an event like this. And three, support of our healthcare workers is crucial. So we need to, whatever we're going through with the pandemic or whatever it is, we need to make sure that we support our health care workers. So thank you. That's the presentation for tonight. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can just use your the chat box down below, and it will show up to anyone, to everyone in this session, and I will try to answer it. Does anyone have any questions? I think we might have one question. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. I will send, I'll have if you'll send me an email, my email is tgnutt@uams.edu, and I will send you the link to it. I don't have the link. They only give me the link after it's finished recording. Let me see. Did people resist the quarantine as they are now? Yes, they did. There was some resistance to it as now. People didn't want the government telling them what to do. It seems the older population was not much as affected as younger during this pandemic. Yes, that's correct. The 1918 flu actually affected the younger population more so than it did the older population, which is reverse of how it's doing now with the older population. How bad did it get in 1919? It was, the deaths went dramatically down in 1919, and the severity of the actual flu was not as high as it was during the 1918. The fall wave of it was the deadliest, and it was the most severe. Let me see if yes, my email, I'll type it in. Here is my email address. And so if you'd like the link to I can send you the link. And Morgan Smith was dean of the school and a pediatrician. Perhaps he was overwhelmed during the flu. Perhaps one reason school was not so prominent. That's very likely, very, very likely. Yes, 60,000. I do not have any information about outdoor therapy or quinine before the flu. I did not come across any of that when I was doing research for this presentation. During the yellow fever epidemics, there were armed people guarding the roads to enforce the quarantines. Did they have something like that during this time? I did not see any reference to anyone, any peace officers guarding or soldiers guarding any roads or enforcing anything. Can you tell us about a COWS event that you are hosting later this month? Yes, on May 21st, which is also the date of our next stay-at-home lecture at 7 o'clock, and I'll be presenting that night as well. But at noon on that day, CALS, the public library, is hosting an event with the author of Pandemic 1918 about the flu pandemic. And that's going to be on a Zoom. That'll be Zoom as well. I don't know what the link is right now. I think it's on the CALS website, but I'll be moderating that session as well. And then you'll see me again that night if you tune in to this. There wasn't much the medical school could do except send nurses. Correct. Just a note, in the late 1970s, my dad's doctor said my dad still had detectable antibodies from the 1918 flu. That's interesting. Was there apocalyptic fear? The song text seemed it had a bit. I think with the, you know, that the 19-teens and 1920s, you had a lot of some of the end of the world groups around, and I think there was probably, they saw the 1918 pandemic as sort of a part of the apocalypse. And just like as today, you hear some people saying that it's part of the end of the world coming. What is the limit for the participation for the CALS events? I think it's, I'm not sure, since it's on Zoom, I think it's probably, it's pretty high. I think, you know, I don't know what the number, what they're limiting at, but I would think it'd be above 100. I'm not positive of that. Federal state conflict. I think there was some federal and state conflict associated with this. The Department of Health, you notice that I did not, yes, Zoom can handle hundreds if the bandwidth holds. And I think CALS probably has a subscription large enough for people to join in, and I think they're banned. I don't think you should have a problem if you're tuning in for that. But you'll notice that I did not mention the Department of Health, the State Department of Health, very often during this presentation. And that's because the Department of Health was fairly new. It had only been established in 1913, and they didn't really have very much power to do anything. And so, but I still think, and so the official, the U.S. health official, service official, took charge of running the fight against of the pandemic here in Arkansas. And I'm sure that there were probably conflicts between the two. I don't know, I can't go into detail about what the conflicts were because I don't have my notes in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that there were conflicts. I will say that Jim Pfeiffer has written a brief account of the flu and on his History of the Heights Facebook post. So if you have Facebook, look up History of the Heights, and Jim has put something on there about the flu and how it relates to one of the houses there. Morgan Smith, instrumental in establishing health department, but I agree that it was not powerful. Smith became frustrated with hookworm efforts. Correct. There was also the hookworm going on at the same time, and there was also the tick eradication, and there were quarantines from ticks on cattle at the same time. So there are a lot of things going on in the late 19-teens. Any other questions? I'm going to type my email one more time, and if you have any questions or if you'd like the link for this recording, I'll be happy to email it to you. And you can always call me as well. Historical Research Center, my number is 686-6735. Okay, thank y'all. Hope y'all be able to be here on May 21st. We'll see you then. Thank y'all.